Isabella Montgomery stood at the edge of Central Park, her designer heels sinking slightly into the damp grass as she watched James Carter perform. His violin sang with a passion that made her heart ache, drawing a growing crowd of mesmerized onlookers. The morning sun caught the scratches on his weathered instrument, but the music it produced was pure magic. She should have been at the Montgomery Industries board meeting 20 minutes ago. Her father, Richard Montgomery, would be furious again. But there was something about this street musician that kept pulling her back day after day. It wasn't just his striking features or the way his dark curls fell across his forehead as he played. It was the raw emotion in every note, the story his music told of struggle and hope. James finished his piece, and the crowd erupted in applause. As people dropped bills into his open violin case, his eyes met Isabella's. He'd noticed her watching him every morning for the past week, this elegant woman who seemed so out of place among the usual park crowd. There was a sadness in her eyes that contradicted her perfectly polished appearance. Isabella's phone buzzed for the 10th time. Without looking, she knew it would be another message from her father's assistant, Charlotte. The board meeting couldn't start without her. She was, after all, the CFO of Montgomery Industries, even if most people assumed she'd gotten the position solely because of her last name. "Same time tomorrow," James called out as she turned to leave. His voice was warm, with a hint of playfulness that made her pause. Isabella looked back, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I have a better idea," she said, walking toward him. "How about dinner tonight?" The words left her mouth before she could stop them. James raised an eyebrow, studying her with intense green eyes. "Dinner? With the mysterious woman in designer suits who watches me play every morning? I don't even know your name." "Isabella," she said, extending her hand. "Isabella Montgomery." Recognition flickered across his face. The Montgomerys were practically royalty in New York's business world, but instead of the usual fawning response she'd grown accustomed to, James simply smiled and took her hand. "James Carter, and I should warn you, I can't afford the kind of restaurants someone like you probably frequents." "Then I'll cook," Isabella replied, surprising herself again. She hadn't cooked for anyone since culinary school, before her father convinced her that a business degree would be more suitable for a Montgomery. That evening, Isabella's penthouse filled with the aroma of herbs and garlic as she prepared her grandmother's secret recipe for coq au vin. James arrived exactly on time, having traded his street clothes for a clean but clearly well-worn button-down shirt. He carried his violin case and a bottle of wine that she suspected had cost him more than he could afford. "I thought maybe you could teach me about fine dining," he said, handing her the wine, "and I could teach you about music." As they talked over dinner, Isabella found herself opening up about things she'd never shared with anyone. Her dream of opening a restaurant, the pressure of being Richard Montgomery's only heir, the loneliness of living up to everyone's expectations. James listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that showed he was truly interested in understanding her, not her family's fortune. In turn, he shared his own story. He'd been a prodigy at Juilliard until his parents' death left him responsible for his younger sister's care. Unable to balance his studies with working to support them, he'd left school. Now his sister was in college herself, thanks to his years of playing on streets and in subway stations. "I don't regret it," he said, his fingers absently tracing the stem of his wine glass. "Music isn't about prestigious concert halls. It's about touching people's hearts, making them feel something real." The evening stretched into night, and somewhere between James teaching her the basic positions on his violin and them sharing stories about their dreams, Isabella realized she was falling for him. It wasn't just his talent or his good looks, it was his authenticity, his unwavering dedication to his art and his family, his ability to find beauty in life despite its hardships. As James prepared to leave, he hesitated at the door. "This might sound crazy," he said, "but I feel like I've known you my whole life." Isabella stepped closer, her heart racing. Not crazy at all. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, like the first notes of a new composition. When they finally pulled apart, both knew their lives had changed irrevocably. What they didn't know was that across town, in his mansion on the Upper East Side, Richard Montgomery was already aware of his daughter's dinner guest. His private security team had sent him photos of James entering Isabella's building. As he stared at the images on his tablet, his face darkened with anger and determination. "Find out everything about this street musician," he commanded his head of security. "I will not let some fortune hunter destroy everything I've built." The security chief nodded and left, leaving Richard alone with his plotting. He'd worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let his daughter throw it all away on a penniless violinist. Little did he know, his interference would set in motion events that would change not only Isabella and James's lives, but the very foundation of Montgomery Industries itself. Can love survive when billions are at stake? Keep watching to discover the shocking truth that will change everything. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of stolen moments and secret meetings. Isabella found herself sneaking out of board meetings to watch James perform in different spots around the city. He, in turn, would surprise her with impromptu serenades outside her office building. Much to the delight of passing pedestrians, their different worlds were colliding in the most beautiful way, but storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. One morning, Isabella arrived at Montgomery Industries to find her father waiting in her office. Richard Montgomery's imposing figure stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection ghostly against the Manhattan skyline. The manila folder in his hands made her stomach twist. "Would you care to explain this?" He tossed the folder onto her desk. Photographs spilled out, herself and James at various locations around the city, sharing meals, walking hand in hand, kissing in what they thought were private moments. "You've been having me followed." Isabella's voice trembled with anger. "I'm protecting our family's interests." Richard's voice was cold, calculated. James Carter, age 28, dropped out of Juilliard after his parents' death. No stable income, no prospects. Mountains of debt from his sister's education. Tell me, Isabella, what exactly do you think you're doing with someone like him? Someone like him. Isabella felt her face flush. You mean someone talented, hard-working, and genuine? Someone who actually cares about more than just money and power? Richard's laugh was sharp and bitter. Genuine, please. He's clearly after your inheritance. Do you really think a street musician just happens to fall in love with one of New York's wealthiest heiresses? You don't know him, Isabella protested, but her father cut her off. I know his type, and I know you're smarter than this. He pulled another document from his briefcase. The Reynolds merger is happening next month. Their board is already nervous about having someone so young as CFO. If word gets out about this inappropriate relationship, it could jeopardize everything we've worked for. Everything you've worked for, Isabella corrected. Did you ever ask what I wanted? I'm trying to secure your future. Richard's voice softened slightly. Everything I've done has been for you, to give you the life you deserve. The life you think I deserve, Isabella replied. But what about the life I want? Before Richard could respond, Isabella's assistant knocked and entered hurriedly. Miss Montgomery, you need to see this. She handed Isabella her tablet, open to a financial news website. The headline made Isabella's blood run cold. Montgomery heiress's secret romance with street performer raises questions about company leadership. The article was brutal, questioning her judgment, her competence, and James's motives. Anonymous sources suggested she was emotionally unstable, unfit for her position. The comment section was already filling with speculation about James being a gold digger. The Reynolds family will see this, Richard said quietly, along with every other business partner and investor we have. Is he worth throwing away everything you've worked for? Isabella's phone buzzed with a text from James. Have you seen the article? We need to talk. She found him in their usual spot in Central Park, but he wasn't playing. His violin case lay closed beside him, and his face was drawn with worry. I'm so sorry, he began. I never meant to cause problems for you or your company. It's not your fault, Isabella said, reaching for his hand. My father's behind this, I'm sure of it. He's trying to force us apart. Maybe he's right, James said softly. Look at what I'm doing to your life, your career. You've worked so hard to prove yourself and I'm destroying it all. Don't say that, Isabella insisted. What we have is real. It's worth fighting for. James pulled away, running his hands through his hair in frustration. Is it? Your father's right about one thing. I have nothing to offer you. I can barely support myself, let alone... I don't need you to support me, Isabella interrupted. I need you to love me, to believe in me, the way I believe in you. James was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the park where they'd first met. Finally, he turned to her with determination in his eyes. Then let's give them something to really talk about. He dropped to one knee, pulling a simple silver ring from his pocket. It was nothing like the elaborate jewelry Isabella was used to, but her heart stopped at the sight of it. I was going to wait. Do this properly, he said, his voice shaking slightly. I've been saving for months for a better ring, but after today... Isabella Montgomery, I love you. I love your strength, your passion, your kindness. I love that you see me for who I am, not what I have or don't have. Will you marry me? Isabella felt tears streaming down her face as she nodded. Yes, she whispered. 1,000 times yes. The joy of their engagement was short-lived. That evening, Isabella's father called an emergency board meeting. As she walked into the conference room, she knew something was terribly wrong. The board members wouldn't meet her eyes, and Richard's expression was grimmer than she'd ever seen it. The board has concluded, Richard announced, that recent events have created a conflict of interest that compromises your ability to serve as CFO. We're offering you a choice. Either end this relationship with Mr. Carter or step down from your position. Isabella felt the room spin. You can't do this. We can and we have, one of the board members said. The Reynolds merger is too important to risk. We're protecting the company's interests. You have until tomorrow morning to make your decision, Richard added. Choose wisely, Isabella. As she left the building that night, Isabella's phone rang. It was James's sister, Sarah, calling in tears. James has disappeared, she sobbed. He left a note saying he's sorry, that he loves you, but he can't destroy your life. Isabella, I'm worried about him. He's never done anything like this before. Isabella's world crumbled around her. In trying to protect their love, had they only succeeded in destroying it? As she stared at the engagement ring on her finger, she realized this was more than a choice between love and duty. It was a battle for her very identity, and she would have to fight with everything she had. Will Isabella choose love or her family's legacy? Comment music if you think true love conquers all. Isabella spent the next 3 days in a desperate search for James. She visited every spot where he used to perform, called every contact they shared, but found nothing. His violin case, his most prized possession, remained at his small apartment, a sign that wherever he'd gone, he hadn't planned to play music. On the 4th day, exhausted and heartbroken, she found herself outside Juilliard. Something had drawn her here, to the place where James's dreams had first taken flight and then crashed. As she stood on the steps, an elderly gentleman approached her. You're looking for James Carter, aren't you? He asked. I'm Professor Marcus Chen. I was his mentor here. Isabella followed Professor Chen to his office, a cramped space filled with musical instruments and yellowing sheet music. He pulled out an old recording from his desk drawer. Before you make any decisions about James, there's something you need to see, he said, inserting the disc into his computer. This was James's final performance before he left Juilliard. The video showed a younger James on stage, performing an original composition. The music was unlike anything Isabella had ever heard. Complex, innovative, breathtaking. The audience sat in stunned silence before erupting in thunderous applause. What you just witnessed, Professor Chen said quietly, was arguably one of the most brilliant original compositions of the last decade. James wasn't just talented, he was a genius. His work combined classical elements with modern innovation in ways that could have revolutionized contemporary classical music. But he gave it all up, Isabella whispered. For his sister, yes, but there's more to the story. Professor Chen pulled out an old newspaper. The night of this performance, a major music publishing company offered James a contract worth millions. They wanted to publish his compositions, arrange world tours. It would have solved all his financial problems. Isabella felt her heart race. Why didn't he take it? Because of your father, Ms. Montgomery. The words hit her like a physical blow. What? Montgomery Industries had recently acquired that music publishing company. When Richard Montgomery learned about James's contract, he personally intervened to have it withdrawn. He claimed James was too risky an investment, but the real reason, Professor Chen's voice trailed off. The real reason, Isabella prompted, though she already felt sick with dread. The real reason was that James's parents had been investigating corporate fraud at one of Montgomery Industries' subsidiaries. They were auditors, and they'd uncovered something big. They died in a car accident the very next day. Isabella's world tilted on its axis. No, she whispered. No, my father wouldn't. The official report ruled it an accident, Professor Chen continued gently. But James always suspected there was more to the story. When your father blocked his contract, it confirmed his worst fears. Rather than risk confronting the man he believed responsible for his parents' death, James walked away from everything. Isabella's mind raced through the implications. Her father's immediate opposition to James, his intense reaction to their relationship. It wasn't just about social status or the company's image. It was about keeping a decade-old secret buried. Does James know I'm Richard Montgomery's daughter? She asked, her voice barely audible. No, Professor Chen replied. He never looked into the Montgomery family. I think it was too painful. He focused instead on taking care of his sister. A new determination filled Isabella. She stood up, her hands steadying on Professor Chen's desk. I need copies of everything you have. The performance video, any documentation about the contract, anything about James's parents' investigation. As she gathered the materials, her phone buzzed with a message from Charlotte, her father's assistant. Emergency board meeting tomorrow morning. Your father's announcing the Reynolds merger and your engagement to Thomas Reynolds. Isabella nearly dropped her phone. Thomas Reynolds, the arrogant CEO's son who'd been pursuing her for years. Her father was trying to force her hand, using her absence to reshape her life according to his plans. But now she had leverage, she had truth. Racing back to her apartment, Isabella found Sarah waiting outside her door. I know where James is, Sarah said without preamble. He's at the cabin in the Catskills where we stayed after our parents died. But Isabella, he's not alone. Your father's men followed him there. Fear gripped Isabella's heart. History was threatening to repeat itself, but this time she had the power to stop it. She grabbed her car keys, the file from Professor Chen clutched to her chest. Call this number, she told Sarah, scribbling down her most trusted investigative reporter's contact. Tell her everything about your parents' investigation. Everything. Then get somewhere safe and wait for my call. What are you going to do? Sarah asked, fear evident in her voice. I'm going to stop my father, Isabella replied, and I'm going to save the man I love. The drive to the Catskills was treacherous in the gathering darkness. Rain lashed against her windshield as Isabella pushed her car faster, knowing she was racing against time. Her father's security team was already there, and she knew better than anyone what Richard Montgomery was capable of when he felt threatened. As she navigated the winding mountain roads, her mind whirled with possibilities. The evidence about James's parents could destroy Montgomery Industries, but wielding it meant potentially destroying her own family, her own future. Yet as she thought of James, his talent, his sacrifice, his unfailing integrity, she knew there was only one right choice. The cabin finally came into view, a dim light glowing from within. 2 black SUVs were parked outside, her father's security detail. As she killed her engine and crept closer, she could hear raised voices from inside. Through the window, she saw James standing in the cabin's main room, facing off against 2 of her father's security men. And there, in the shadows, stood Richard Montgomery himself. "It's time to end this," she heard her father say. "Sign these papers renouncing any claim to Isabella or Montgomery Industries, and you can walk away. Refuse, and we'll have to handle this differently." Isabella's hand tightened on the file she carried. It was time to step out of the shadows and face the truth, no matter the cost. But as she reached for the cabin's door, a hand grabbed her shoulder from behind. She spun around to find herself face to face with Thomas Reynolds, his expression a mixture of triumph and malice. "I was wondering when you'd show up," he said. "Your father thought you might try something foolish like this." Before Isabella could scream, Thomas clamped his hand over her mouth. But he hadn't noticed the flash drive she'd palmed from her pocket, or the message she'd already sent to every major news outlet in New York. The truth was already escaping, like music that couldn't be contained. All she had to do now was stay alive long enough to conduct the final movement of this symphony of secrets and lies. A dark secret is about to be revealed. Hit like if you want justice to prevail. Thunder cracked overhead as Isabella struggled against Thomas Reynolds' grip. Inside the cabin, she could hear her father's voice growing more menacing. The flash drive in her palm felt like it was burning. Everything they'd worked to hide for a decade was contained in that tiny device, and major news outlets would be receiving it any moment. "Let's get her inside," Thomas said to someone in the darkness. Another security guard emerged from the shadows, but as he reached for Isabella, she made her move. Years of self-defense training, insisted upon by her father, ironically kicked in. She drove her heel into Thomas's instep and twisted free, only to find herself facing the barrel of a gun. "That's enough," Thomas snarled, all pretense of sophistication gone. "Inside, now." The cabin door burst open as they forced her in. James's eyes widened in horror when he saw her, gun pressed to her back. Richard Montgomery's face went pale. "What are you doing?" he demanded of Thomas. "Put that away immediately." "Sorry, Richard," Thomas smiled coldly, "but we're beyond playing nice. The Reynolds merger isn't just about business. It's about covering our tracks. Your company's fraud, our family's involvement. James's parents were just the beginning." Isabella watched her father's expression shift from shock to understanding to fear. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew all along what happened to James's parents." "Isabella, please," Richard stepped toward her. "Everything I did was to protect our family, our legacy. By murdering innocent people," James's voice cut through the room like a blade, "by destroying lives." "They were going to expose everything," Thomas interjected, "just like you're trying to do now. We know about the evidence you've gathered. Hand over the flash drive, and maybe we can still resolve this." Civilly, Isabella felt the weight of the drive in her palm. "It's too late," she said. "I've already sent everything to the press. Emails are scheduled to go out to the SEC, the FBI, and every major news outlet. In about," she checked her watch, "3 minutes. The truth about Montgomery Industries and Reynolds Corporation will be public knowledge." The color drained from Thomas's face. His gun hand wavered. "You're bluffing," he snarled. "Am I?" Isabella met his gaze steadily. "Check your phone. The story should be breaking right about now." Thomas fumbled for his phone with his free hand. As he did, James moved with the fluid grace of a musician, knocking the gun away. It skittered across the floor as chaos erupted. The security guards rushed forward, but Isabella was faster. She grabbed the fallen weapon and backed toward James. "Nobody move!" "Isabella!" her father's voice broke. "You don't understand what you're doing. This will destroy everything, our family, our company, your future." "No, father." Isabella's hand was steady as she kept the gun trained on Thomas. "You destroyed everything the moment you chose power over people, when you decided that profit was worth more than human lives." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. On Thomas's phone, news alerts were popping up one after another. The truth was spreading like wildfire. "It's over," James said quietly. "After 10 years, it's finally over." Richard Montgomery seemed to age decades before their eyes. He sank into a chair, head in his hands. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he whispered. "Your parents. They wouldn't back down. Reynolds suggested we just buy them off, but they were too principled. The accident. It wasn't supposed to be fatal, but it was." James's voice was raw with emotion. "And then you made sure I lost everything else too. My career, my music, my future. Did you ever think about what that did to my sister? To me? I thought I was protecting Isabella." Richard looked up at his daughter. "When I saw you with her, I was terrified the truth would come out, that she'd hate me forever." "You were right about that," Isabella said, tears streaming down her face. "But not because of what happened back then. Because of what you've done since. Every day you had a chance to make it right, and every day you chose not to." Red and blue lights flashed through the windows as police cars pulled up outside. Thomas made one last desperate move, lunging toward Isabella, but James intercepted him, pinning him to the ground just as FBI agents burst through the door. The next hours passed in a blur of statements and arrests. Thomas Reynolds and Richard Montgomery were led away in handcuffs, along with several board members who were arrested in New York. The story dominated every news channel. Decades of corporate fraud, conspiracy, and cover-ups finally exposed. As dawn broke over the mountains, Isabella and James sat on the cabin's porch, physically and emotionally exhausted. The old recording from Juilliard played softly from Isabella's phone, James's lost masterpiece. "I never thought I'd hear this again," James said softly. "After everything that happened, music just hurt too much." Isabella took his hand. "But you never stopped playing. Even without the recognition, the concert halls, the acclaim, you kept making music because it's who you are." "Music was the only thing that kept me going," he admitted. "That and taking care of Sarah, but I never thought I'd find justice or love or—" He trailed off, looking at her with wonder. "How can you still want to be with me after learning what your father did?" "Because you taught me something important," Isabella said, squeezing his hand. "You showed me that true worth isn't about money or power or status. It's about integrity, about staying true to yourself, no matter what life throws at you. You lost everything, but you never lost yourself." A soft rain began to fall as the sun rose, creating a symphony of gentle patters on the cabin's roof. In the distance, more vehicles were arriving, reporters, federal agents, more investigators. The world was waiting to hear their story, but for now, in this quiet moment between storm and sunrise, Isabella and James held onto each other, knowing that while the past couldn't be changed, they could face whatever came next together. The truth had finally set them free, but it was love that would show them the way forward. "Play for me," Isabella whispered, nodding toward his violin case that Sarah had brought from his apartment. "Not for the world, not for justice or revenge, just for us." James picked up his violin, feeling its familiar weight. For the first time in 10 years, he felt the music rising in him not as an escape or a means of survival, but as pure joy. As he began to play, his original composition took on new life. No longer a reminder of loss, but a promise of renewal. They didn't notice the reporters gathering at the edge of the property, cameras rolling as the haunting melody drifted through the morning mist. They didn't see the video going viral or realize that the world was about to discover not just a scandal, but a story of love, redemption, and the unstoppable power of truth. All they knew was this moment, this music, and the certainty that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what truly matters. The truth is finally exposed. Subscribe now to see if love can heal what greed destroyed. 6 months after the scandal broke, the Montgomery building lobby had been transformed. Where stark corporate minimalism once ruled, music now filled the air. A string quartet played in the corner, their melody floating up through the atrium to all 50 floors. It was just one of many changes Isabella had implemented as the new CEO of Montgomery Industries. The company's transformation had not been easy. In the wake of the arrests, stocks had plummeted, partners had fled, and thousands of jobs had hung in the balance. Isabella had faced a choice. Let the company collapse under the weight of scandal, or rebuild it into something entirely new. She chose to rebuild, but on her own terms. The mahogany-paneled boardroom, once her father's fortress of power, now hosted a very different kind of meeting. Isabella stood at the head of the table, addressing a diverse group of executives and artists. Montgomery Industries was built on the exploitation of others' dreams, she began. Today, we begin making those dreams possible instead. The Montgomery Carter Foundation for the Arts was officially launching, turning the company's vast resources towards supporting young musicians and artists. But it was more than just a charitable endeavor. It was a complete reimagining of how business and art could coexist. James sat beside her, no longer the street musician, but the foundation's creative director. His story had captured the public's imagination. The prodigy who chose his sister over fame, who played on street corners rather than compromise his integrity, who helped expose a decades-long conspiracy. When the recording of his Juilliard performance went viral, the classical music world had exploded with interest. But James had surprised everyone by turning down the flood of concert offers and recording contracts. Instead, he'd chosen to work alongside Isabella, using his experience to identify and support other talented artists who needed help. The foundation isn't just about giving grants, James explained to the board. It's about creating sustainable careers in the arts. Every artist we support becomes part of a larger community, mentoring others and contributing to a cycle of creativity and growth. As the meeting concluded, Sarah, now the Foundation's Educational Outreach Director, approached with their latest candidate files. "You'll want to see this one," she said, handing them a particular folder. "Reminds me of you, James. Single mum, working 3 jobs, playing subway stations between shifts. But listen to this." She played a recording on her phone. The music was raw, untrained, but filled with undeniable genius. James and Isabella exchanged knowing looks. This was exactly why they'd created the foundation. Later that evening, they walked through Central Park, passing the spot where they'd first met. Street musicians still played there. The park had become a key venue for the Foundation's outreach programs. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never stopped here that morning," Isabella mused, squeezing James's hand. "I don't," James replied. "Some things are meant to be, even if the path getting there is harder than we expect." They stopped at a familiar bench, and James pulled out his violin, the same weathered instrument he'd played on these streets. But now, it wasn't just his music that gave people hope. It was his story, their story. "Have you told them what you're planning?" Sarah called, approaching with a group of Foundation students in tow. The young musicians carried their instruments, eyes bright with anticipation. "Not yet," James smiled. "But I think it's time." He turned to Isabella. "Remember that composition you heard from my Juilliard days? I've been working on it again, but differently this time. It's not just my story anymore. It's ours. And I want to premiere it here, in the park, with these students performing alongside me." Isabella felt tears welling up. The piece that had marked the end of his dreams would now herald a new beginning for so many others. "The Montgomery Carter Orchestra's debut performance," she said. "Right where it all began." The students began unpacking their instruments, setting up music stands as a crowd gathered. Word spread quickly through social media. The viral street musician was playing in the park again, this time with his own orchestra. James raised his violin, and the first notes soared into the evening air. The students joined in one by one, each adding their own voice to the symphony. Isabella recognized the core melody from the Juilliard recording, but it had evolved into something richer, more complex, woven through with themes of loss and redemption, love and justice. As the music swelled, Isabella looked around at the growing crowd. There were business executives in suits pausing on their way home, children dancing on the grass, tourists capturing the moment on their phones. But most importantly, There were young artists watching with hope in their eyes, seeing living proof that talent and integrity could triumph over power and greed. Richard Montgomery, serving his sentence in a minimum security prison, had asked to see her only once since his arrest. "I was wrong about everything," he'd told her, "but mostly about what makes a legacy worth having." Isabella hadn't responded then, but watching James conduct his orchestra in the park, seeing the joy on the students' faces, feeling the music touch everyone around them, she finally knew what she would have said. True legacy wasn't about buildings or bank accounts. It was about the lives you touched, the dreams you nurtured, the positive change you created in the world. As the performance ended, thunderous applause echoed through the park. James turned to Isabella, his eyes shining with love and possibility. They'd taken ruins and built something beautiful, transformed a story of corruption into one of redemption. "Ready for what comes next?" he asked, pulling her close. Isabella smiled, touching the simple wedding band on her finger, still the same one he'd proposed with in this very park. "With you, always." The sun set over Manhattan, painting the sky in brilliant colors as music continued to fill the air. Somewhere in the city, another young musician was playing on a street corner. Another dream was waiting to be discovered. And thanks to two people who dared to rewrite their story, that dream now had a chance to become reality. The Montgomery building still stood tall against the skyline, but it no longer cast a shadow of power and intimidation. Instead, it had become a beacon of hope. Its halls filled with music, its resources dedicated to nurturing the very dreams it had once destroyed. And in the end, that was the greatest love story of all. Not just between two people, but between art and commerce, between past and future, between the world as it was and as it could be. Isabella and James had proved that sometimes the most powerful changes come not from tearing everything down, but from finding new ways to build something better. Together, they'd composed a new kind of symphony, one that would play on through the lives they touched, the artists they helped, and the legacy of love, music, and justice they created. It was a melody that would echo through generations, proving that even in the darkest moments, beauty could bloom, love could triumph, and music could heal what once seemed broken beyond repair. What would you have done in Isabella's position? Choose love or family legacy? What do you think about James's decision to give up fame for his sister? If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Your support keeps our channel going strong, bringing you powerful stories of love and redemption every single day. And if you loved this emotional journey,